Welcome back, students, and all of you listening in today or watching this live stream or later watching the video. We are today, as those of you who are at home here at the ITI, we are today here in the St. Cyril and Methodius Hall. It's our biggest classroom on campus, and it's actually the classroom with the most beautiful view onto the Schloss Park, or the gardens of the Schloss that stretch out around the castle, which is the main building of the ITI. It's a very beautiful garden, especially now in this time of the year. Really a place I wish our students and our visitors could be during this beautiful time of spring. So today's reflections. I have 3 points I would like to discuss you as we continue our analysis on the corona crisis, how we got there, why we have responded in the way we are responding, and what might be answers for the future. First of all, I want to thank all the students who have sent me responses, suggestions, ideas. I'm very grateful for that. And today, 3 themes I would like to discuss. First, I would like to speak about freedom and liberty, then as a consequence of religious and conscience freedom, and then following that, again, I would like to make some remarks as a result of that about Christian leadership. The first point, freedom and liberty. I have been reflecting on that a lot during the past days because yesterday, the 5th of May, is a very important day in my country, the Netherlands. It is the day that we celebrate Liberation Day. It is the day that we celebrate the end of the occupation in 1945 and the end of the Second World War in 1945. It was the end of the occupation by the German army and forces and Nazi forces at that time. And it's a very important day in the history of the Netherlands because the Netherlands suffered very much under the war and under the occupation. And yesterday I was watching a little bit the events that usually take place on May the 5th and May the 4th. And in a way, it was very shocking to see that for the first time in 75 years, because this year we celebrate 75 years of freedom from occupation in the Netherlands. And it was the first time in history that this day was celebrated with no public. And on the 4th of May in the evening at 8 p.m. we always have the remembrance of the dead on the main square in Amsterdam in front of the Royal Palace. And there is a monument there to the fallen. And every year the king and his wife and the prime minister go there to lay flowers, and the king gives a speech. And this year he walked together with his wife, the queen, all alone over a complete empty square. And he was only joined by the mayor and by the prime minister. And of course there were some soldiers who were accompanying them. But there were very few people there. Usually there are thousands of people there. And the day after, on May the 5th, there are many celebrations. And this year, this was not so. Of course, due to the corona crisis. But it was all the same a very worthy remembrance. And this made me realize once again the price that has been paid in Europe for liberty. In 1945, it was the end of occupation for those in Western Europe, but in Eastern and Central Europe, this continued until 1989, 1991, when communism was finally defeated in Europe. And I was thinking and reflecting these days on how privileged I am, how privileged we are in Western Europe with having enjoyed liberty and freedom for such a long, uninterrupted time. Because I even grew up with so many stories of the war, because both my parents lived through the war as teenagers. In fact, both my grandfathers were, so to say, on the list of the occupying forces. My grandfather on my father's side was arrested by the Gestapo during the first days of the war and only released after some weeks, and until the day of today we do not know what happened to him. We know, obviously, my grandfather returned, but he never spoke about this time. And my maternal grandfather would have also been arrested were it not for the smartness of my maternal grandmother, who hid him in the kitchen under the floor, under the kitchen table, whilst my grandmother with their 8 children were singing songs as the soldiers were searching for the house looking for my grandfather, because he actually was coordinating in the south of the Netherlands a food aid program for those that were living in hiding. And then my father, who as a boy of 11 and later 12 years old, during the last months of the war in the so-called hunger winter, when the north of the Netherlands was suffering from extreme cold and a famine, my father would go on his bike as an 11-year-old out of the city of Utrecht and into the surrounding villages, knocking at the doors of farmers to get some food for him, his parents, and his 5 siblings. And often he had to jump with his bike in a ditch because either German tanks were passing that might run over him, or British or American bombers were flying over and bombing such military vehicles. So it was not without danger. How much our liberty and how much our freedom is worth. And I think it's good to reflect on it during these days. Why? Because we live in a time that, in fact, due to the circumstances, our liberties and our freedoms are being limited. In those countries, especially where we're not used to that. There are, of course, many countries in the world where there is no freedom, where there is no liberty. But those of us who live in Western democracies have had this great gift of freedom and liberty, and now, because of the corona crisis, we're experiencing, in a small way, uncomparable to other countries and to the Second World War, but still we're experiencing a small bit of what it means that our freedoms, our liberty is actually being limited. And it's good to realize that, because it will hopefully also encourage us not to allow that this limitation of our freedoms and of our liberties continues any day longer than is strictly necessary in those current circumstances. And that's why I sent you this wonderful article yesterday in a British newspaper that describes very well how, in fact, any government, whether democratic or totalitarian, has throughout history actually held on to certain emergency powers also long after it was necessary. So I think it's good that we realize that and that we are critical at that. This brings me to religious freedom. That is, of course, intrinsically linked to this. And lately I have been reading a wonderful book written by an Austrian journalist and writer by the name of Martin Mosebach, who writes a book called The 21. And it's a book about the 21 Coptic Christian martyrs that were killed by Islamic terrorists on the 15th of February 2015 on a beach in Libya. And he writes in very moving terms about the individual lives of these 21 Christian martyrs. And he asks many serious questions in that book. And one of the questions, or one of the comments he makes, have really made me think, again in the light of current events, because we have also experienced here, again in Western democracies, in a small way, but still in a painful way, what it means if our religious liberty is being limited by circumstances. And this is what Martin Mosebach says when he writes about the 21 martyrs and how our Western societies are struggling to understand why these 21 men gave their lives for Christ. This is what he says. We live in an era of strict privatization of religion, and we have voluntarily subjected it to the secular order. There exists a consensus in society that rejects evangelizing and religious zeal. I find this a very powerful statement, because he really puts the finger on the wound. And that is that we as Christians, in especially Western secular societies, have all too easily subjected our religious life to the norms of the state, without really always reflecting whether that is right or not. And I think the current circumstances of the corona crisis and the limitations that have been put on religious practice are a very good moment to reflect on this and to ask ourselves, is this right? Is this necessary? Or could things have been done, yes or no, in another way? And actually today we celebrate the memorial of some important Catholic saints who gave their lives for their faith. There are actually 3 of them I would like to mention to you today. The first one is Blessed Anthony of Middleton, one of the many martyrs that were trained in colleges in France and then shipped back secretly to England during the time of the 16th century to minister in secret to the underground Catholics. And Blessed Anthony of Middleton was one of those many priests, mostly Jesuit priests, who gave their lives ministering to the underground Catholics in the England at that time. And he was hanged, drawn, and quartered on the 6th of May, 1590, for simply being a priest. And these were his words just before he had his last breath on the scaffold. He said, "I call God to witness, I die merely for the Catholic faith and for being a priest of the true religion." Many hundreds of years later, we have, and again I'm giving examples of thousands of examples, 2 Polish saints, Blessed Henryk Kaczorowski and Blessed Kazimierz Gotzinski, both priests that were gassed by the Nazis on the 6th of May 1942 for being priests who continued to minister to their fellow prisoners in the concentration camp of Dachau, where they were interred. And these are just 3 examples. 3 examples of people who gave their lives for their faith, along with the 21 martyrs of the Coptic Church that I just mentioned to you earlier, that died much more recently, 5 years ago. Why am I giving you these examples in relation to religious liberty? Because it shows that we have great saints in the Christian faith who took their freedom of religion, and especially of those who they had to take care of, those to whom they had to minister, they took that very literal, they took that very serious. And they can be an inspiration for us in these times where we live in a time of history, where the persecution of the Christians has never been as bad as it is now. And specifically in the COVID-19 crisis, the reports that I am getting is that in fact persecution of Christians during this time of the corona crisis is not becoming less. In fact, it is becoming more. Because in many regions, regimes or groups are taking advantage of the world paying attention to other things. For example, I've been reading reports coming from Pakistan, from India, from Burkina Faso, just to name but a few countries, where Christians are actually being discriminated against when it comes to the distribution of food parcels because they are Christians, or where they are being persecuted, hunted down, killed because the perpetrators think that nobody is paying attention. So yes, this is a problem that is really taking place today. But I do think that we Christians, and especially those of us who are Catholics, who are suffering from the absence of the Holy Eucharist in many countries, I think this Eucharistic fasting, which is very tough, can also be offered up for those fellow Christians that are being hunted down, that are being persecuted, as we speak in so many different countries. So our religious freedom is something that is worth fighting for. And we have so many great saints to inspire us and to encourage us to do so. And again, this corona crisis can be a reminder for us, as we are in a very small way also suffering from a limitation in our religious life. We can probably be through that reminded how important it is that we actually take care also of those who do not have a voice. And thirdly, as always, during the last couple of weeks, I conclude with a point as to Christian leadership. There's a lot to say about leadership in itself, but what makes a leader a Christian leader, and what makes leadership Christian leadership? I've been thinking about that too, and it seems to me that there is one thing that is the most important there, and that is a Christian leader, as to, in comparison to a non-Christian leader, the Christian leader has a great advantage and a great added responsibility. Because we Christians have been gifted with faith, hope, and love. And faith, hope, and love give us a perspective in taking responsibility, in assuming leadership, that goes above and beyond what would be normally expected. So our responsibility is far greater because we have been given more, because we have been given the gift of faith, hope, and love. This broadens the horizon, this broadens the perspective. And I would like to focus on one point here in response to what one of the students wrote me. One of the students wrote me a beautiful little reflection in which she, amongst others, said, but shouldn't we focus more on prayer? And shouldn't we not be careful that we're not continuously thinking of action, 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 but that everything we do should be rooted in an equal measure of prayer, if not more measures of prayer? And I think she's absolutely right. If what we do as Christian leaders is not deeply rooted in prayer, in a prayer life that is consistent, then we will not be able to take our responsibility. Then we will not be able to see where the Holy Spirit is leading us, where God is leading us. So yes, I would say, as a Christian leader, anything we do has to start with prayer, has to end with prayer, and has to have prayer in the middle. That I'm absolutely convinced. And I'm sure that we're all trying to live that, and we're all struggling with that at times. But that is absolutely essential. And so, what does the Christian leader need to do in this situation, where it comes to making sure that our freedom and our liberty is not eroded, that religious freedom is actually an issue that is at the top of our agenda? Well, first of all, prayer. But second of all, we have to make our voices heard. We have to write to our constituent legislators, those in your region, in your city. Make sure that you speak to your members of Congress, to your members of Parliament, to make sure that they pay attention to these issues. And wherever you can yourself, help those in need. Of course, there's a lot to say to that, and today's live stream is too short to go into that in detail. But the point I want to make is that the defining battle of the 21st century is the battle for freedom of conscience and religion. It has never been threatened more and more massively around the world as we see it today. And I think everybody, and we realize that yet today, specifically through the corona crisis, I think every one of us whose faith is dear to them should make it a priority in their lives, according to their possibilities, according to their talents, to be aware of that, to include it in your daily prayers, and to engage with this topic in whatever way you can. It, in any case, has to be said, it has to be heard. So that's my message for today. I would like to invite you to reflect about. The Christian leader is never asleep and is also always very aware of what happens in the world around him or herself. I would now like to invite you again, as always, to send in your comments and your questions, your suggestions. And whilst you are doing that, I have also an interesting announcement to make as to the upcoming live streams. So please go ahead and send your comments right now whilst I make this announcement. During the past weeks, you have heard a lot from me, and what I would like to start doing next week is, as of next week until the end of the semester, when we will pause these weekly live streams, I would like to invite every week, as much as possible, a guest to this live stream. A guest that I will then be asking questions along the reflections and the discussions we have been having during the past weeks. Again, trying to analyze, trying to understand, and trying to learn from this corona crisis and how it should affect our lives and our futures. And the first guest, he's not really a guest, but a guest to this live stream. The first guest that I have invited and who has already accepted is that next week will be sitting next to me our beloved Dean, Dr. Bernard Dolna, with whom I will be having a conversation during this time. And I'm very much looking forward to it because Dr. Dolna is one of the most remarkable people I know, a very dear friend of mine. So this is certainly going to be a very interesting live stream conversation. I will now move to the question time. So, thank you, Andre. You say it was good to be reminded of the example of the saints. Yes, and the interesting thing is we have such a rich compendium of saints, yet we so often forget how easily in reach these saints of Christianity are for us. So again, also as I was preparing for this live stream, it was for me again a new revelation, but they're right there. We just only have to look at them. Whilst you are probably formulating other questions, I would like to tell you one more brief story. which relates to a book I've recently read. It's a book called A Higher Call by Adam Makos. And it's the story of two pilots during the Second World War, a German pilot and an American pilot. The German pilot was a fighter pilot, obviously flying his fighter jet, his fighter plane for the German Reich. And the other one was an American pilot who was flying a B-17 bomber during the Second World War. And this amazingly beautiful story is that one day there is a air fight where this bomber who had just bombed the city of Bremen, this American bomber, was flying back towards England and was then hunted down by a number of German fighter planes. And they pretty badly shot to pieces that American plane, that American B-17 bomber, but miraculously the plane stayed in the air, although it made a drop of thousands of feet and almost crashed, but for some reason the plane stayed in the air, although the stabilizer, half of the stabilizer at the back of the plane was broken off. And this plane was flying very low and struggling to get out of German airspace. And there were many wounded airmen on board, and the pilot and the co-pilot were just recovering from losing consciousness because of the fall. And so they were struggling, trying to get over the North Sea. And then a German pilot in a fighter jet actually got a hold of them and started flying behind them and saw in what bad state the plane was. And he then started flying next to them. And he actually saw from the side all these holes in the plane, and through the holes he could see how these airmen were taking care of each other. And then the German pilot describes that he felt in himself a voice that says, "No, you have a higher call now. You should let these people live and not shoot down the plane." And this pilot actually went as far as escorting the American B-17 all the way to the North Sea, past the German anti-aircraft batteries, because he knew that if he, as a German fighter jet, would fly along the plane, they would not shoot at him. And he escorted them all the way to the North Sea and then turned around and landed and never told, of course, his superiors what he did. Also never believing that the US bomber would ever make it to England because it was in such bad shape. But miraculously, the bomber did make it and landed. A long story short, 40 years later, those two pilots, through a very difficult search, and both their hearts being still moved by that event, because obviously the American pilot had seen that he hadn't been shot down, and when the German fighter pilot flew away, he saluted the American pilot, and the American pilot saw that. So they were both thinking about that for decades, and finally they meet each other, and they become the best of friends. And then both of them started telling their story around the world. And of course, this has moved the hearts of many people. Turns out that the American pilot was a practicing Protestant. I think he was a Baptist Christian, and the German pilot was a practicing Catholic. And they both had their faith strongly present in their lives. Now, of course, the German pilot was verbally abused by many, both in the United States for being a former German pilot and in Germany for not shooting down the plane at the time. But he was convinced that he had done the right thing. And this led to a story of hope for so many people, because he had followed in his heart a voice at that time in 1943 not to shoot down that plane. And that led to 9 men surviving the war, founding families, and going on to live, despite of the fact that that plane had just bombed a city where thousands of other people died. So it shows how in the difficult situations of war, something like that can happen when people follow their hearts. I found that a very beautiful story to still add, to show all the perspectives. A question I have is from Gintas, who writes, "You wrote about the Netherlands yesterday, the anniversary of the liberation. Do you think there is any bit of liberation from the prison of the hedonistic lifestyle brought by the current pandemics, paradoxically?" Gintas, that's obviously an excellent question. I think there's certainly no freedom in the hedonistic society in which we live, in the sense of it really bringing people into such difficult and often life-threatening situations. But at least we live in a society where we can still speak about that openly, where we can still discuss it, although those discussions are often being very much limited by political correctness or by certain narratives that are being pushed. But although increasingly we have examples of people being silenced through different ways, we still live in a society where we can debate, where we can vote certain parties out of office, and where we can, at least in most of the democracies, where we can still practice our faith freely, despite all the limitations that we have today. We can be grateful for not having to live through that which many of you in Eastern Central Europe have lived through under communism, through which millions of people now live through in other communist countries. Obviously, China is a very clear example of that, where the persecution of Christians is vehement and continues vehemently until today. I think we're dealing with two different sorts of lack of liberty. There is the lack of liberty that we have created for ourselves in rich, affluent societies, about which I've spoken in previous live streams, where we have thought that we, as the human being, as man, have become master over life, death, and creation. And therefore, as we all know, our rich societies have often become completely captive, enslaved to their passions and their feelings and their opinions. That is one sort of lack of liberty and freedom. And then there is the other sort of those countries where there are totalitarian regimes, or where there are ideologies ruling, where people do not have the freedom of their religion. I'm thinking, of course, of many countries where Christians are being persecuted, in the Middle East, where there is so much suffering amongst our fellow Christians, or in Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, the persecution of the Christians is continuing. So there are, I would say, two different sorts of situations where our liberty or where freedom of religion is being limited. Thank you. I'm looking at my watch. We're already beyond time. So I would like to thank you for participating in this week's live stream. And I look very much forward to next week, where I will be speaking with Dr. Dolna, continuing these reflections and continuing this debate on our corona-driven society and what we can learn from it. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I wish you a very good continuation of the week.